Thanks very much for joining us for episode 6 of InTek Freight and Logistics, the podcast. I'm Kevin Baxter, and I'm joined by my co-host for this edition, InTek CEO Rick Lagore.
Welcome back. Thank you again.
Hey, Rick. On this episode, we speak with a journalist who has his finger on the pulse of the freight industry about his background, how he came to focus his reporting on shipping and transportation, and we take a look at the state of the market today. Then we check in on a few big California-related headlines and the Mercury Gate Minute. Let's get started. Our guest for this edition has been a reporter since 2006 and has focused exclusively on the freight market since 2016. He's won a regional Edward R. Murrow Award for investigative journalism, and you can currently find his work both at the Industry Standard Journal of Commerce as well as his Substack, Please Haul My Freight. Welcome to the podcast, Ari Ashe.
Thank you for having me.
So, Ari, first off, tell us a bit about your role with the Journal of Commerce and sort of what a typical day looks like for you there.
In a certain way, I'm a jack of all trades because I've got in my portfolio ports, the Southeast ports. So think anything from Virginia down through Florida. I have intermodal, which is obviously a lot of what we'll be talking about here. So international intermodal, domestic 53-foot intermodal. And then I've got trucking in my portfolio as well with Bill Cassidy. Naturally makes sense, especially on the 53-foot side. You can't really cover 53-foot intermodal without having a firm pulse on what's going on in the 53-foot truckload world, and to a limited extent as well, the LTL industry, since they use intermodal quite a bit. The typical day for me, actually, at this point, is as much story-driven as it is data-driven and also conversation-driven. So I actually would tell you I have 4 hats in a given day that I have to juggle. Hat 1 would be the event planner because, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, we've got the TPM conference we do at the end of February every year, and then the big domestic conference where we cover intermodal quite a bit in Chicago, which this year will be September 25th to 27th. So it's one hat of event planning. What sessions do we do? Recruiting people, mixing and matching where we put people on the platform. So that's hat 1. Then hat 2 is conversations and reporting, which I throw into the same bucket. I have a schedule. If you look at my schedule on any given day, it is littered with conversations with shippers, IMCs, NVOCCs, drayage companies. So large portions of my day are split between writing and talking to people because you can't do the job that I do without talking to people and talking about what is happening on the front lines. And then I would say, again, reporter sort of hat 3 there, and then hat 4 is the data side. And I know we'll talk about this as well, the JOC Intermodal Savings Index, which requires a lot of time and effort to pull a lot of data, using Rick's great data that he provides us on the spot intermodal side, intermodal contract data, trucking data, and then our new surveys that we're surveying the IMCs and we're surveying the shippers out there to really find out who is executing best as far as the railroads go and who is executing best in terms of the IMC community and a service-oriented data set. And so data collector and data analyzer is that 4th hat. Every day is very busy for me at this point.
Yeah, sounds like it. So going back a bit, and we like asking this of our guests, how did you sort of end up in journalism? I know you went to school for history and political science, but journalism, you can kind of still be aiming for that even with some different majors. So were you always looking at that as a career choice?
A good question. So in college, as you mentioned, political science, history, I always loved those classes, social studies and whatnot in high school, middle school and high school. As I was going through college and going through that track, I would do internships on Capitol Hill. Let me take a step back. I went to school at the George Washington University, which is in downtown Washington, D.C. So I would do internships on Capitol Hill and very political heavy internships. While I was doing all that, I've always had this side of me that I know, Rick, you know of, and you could see it in my social media profiles. I've always been a big sports fan. That's the other big side of me. So one of the things I wanted to do in college as an outlet, as a hobby, was to be on the radio station. And so college radio station, which not only did we do sports programming, which, I was part of, but I also was involved in the broadcast. So they broadcast all sorts of George Washington University sports, basketball, the whole gamut. And so I would participate in the sporting stuff as well. And so as I got through college, I kind of despised the political stuff, and I can't even imagine wanting to do it now. It was not even a tenth of what it is now
Yeah.
back then, but it was much then, and it required a certain personality that I didn't have. And so as I got out of it, I said, you know what, I really want to do this sports stuff. I don't really want to do the politics. I don't like politics. I don't want to go into politics. And so the step from there became, okay, how do I parlay what I did on my free time into more of a career? Did some internships, which you may ask about, that kind of stayed into the sports area, and then went to graduate school at Syracuse at the famed Newhouse School of Broadcasting. Got my degree there and really delved into the sports side for a while. And then I said, all right, I want to come back to Washington, D.C. Love Washington, D.C. I just didn't like the politics side, but most of my friends that I developed in college were still in Washington, D.C. So I decided to go to WTOP, and that's I think currently still a CBS affiliate in Washington, D.C., an all-new station. I started in their sports department, and then eventually worked my way back over towards news and realized, okay, I like journalism. I don't think I have the skill set to become a success in the sports area. So few do. How do I kind of marry my political science and history degree and my love for journalism and radio specifically into a career? That's kind of how I got started in all of this.
Yeah, kind of a natural progression when you put it that way. It's
Natural, but still a roundabout.
Yeah.
Yeah. And as it went along, so I brought together, I still did some sports on the side because they have a sports department covering obviously all the teams down in Washington, D.C. And then more and more it became, okay, now I'm re-embracing politics and history, but more from a news perspective. And then eventually I wanted to branch out, again, learning more about myself. And I wanted to do more reporting as opposed to producing, more of the production side. I wanted to move over to the reporting side. And where that started just by happy accident was an opening in the transportation beat and in the Washington, D.C. market that covers all of the traffic that maybe it's not New York City or Los Angeles or Chicago, but Washington, D.C. has a lot of traffic, and the Capital Beltway is known for its traffic. Some of the interstates connecting to the Capital Beltway known for its traffic, and a thriving subway system, just like in New York and Chicago and Boston, thriving subway systems. There was a lot to cover in the transportation beat that I got to do for 2.5 years. And, eventually it just parlayed into the freight industry, get more on the political side than the business side, because as I was moving on from WTOP, the question became, where do I have the skill set to move out of sort of the hamster wheel that local news is? And it is a hamster wheel and very exhausting. Where do I have that skill set? And freight worked best because part of my job in Washington, D.C. was to cover stuff that went through the US DOT. And so I had a lot of experience on Capitol Hill and a lot of experience, particularly at the US DOT, covering transportation issues, which became attractive to people that were in the news business at transport topics of covering trucking. And so that's sort of how I got my foot in the door with the freight industry. Eventually, I decided, okay, I'd rather do more on the business side than the politics side. But again, it was more and more about learning about myself and saying, I love transportation. I don't like this. So how do we make a tweak to still cover transportation, but cover the aspects of transportation I do like? And eventually I got to this Shangri-La moment where I know what I like. I love transportation. I love covering transportation, but I love covering the business aspect of it, the economics aspect of it. And I kind of shy away whenever possible from the political side of it because it's just not of interest to me.
Right. Now, the stuff that you have in your background on the sporting side, that's completely new to me. So that's super interesting. It also helps explain to me a little bit about all the analytics that you do on the freight rates, whether it's the 53-foot intermodal spot, contract, or truck, and on the spot and the contract side, and cranking through all those numbers every month, the amount of data that you crank through. I now understand it, and the love of it, that at least gets to a portion of probably why you like the sporting side, because so much reporting is about the statistics of the game, what happened here, what happened there, the statistics of individual players and how they're performing and stuff like that. So anyway.
I'm incredibly fortunate in two ways in my life. One being that my love for sports and my experience at the college station at GW landed me that internship at WFAN, which hopefully some of your listeners know is an all sports radio, perhaps the first all sports radio station in New York City, where I grew up. Again, if you look at my social media, it's no secret I'm a big New York Mets fan and the Jets. And
You're our second guest in a row, actually, who's a Mets fan. I just wanted to let you know that.
Big Mets fan. So, yeah, I've always loved numbers, and WFAN kind of helped me with the radio side. A lot of the people there put in a good word for me so that I could get into Syracuse and be able to continue my career in that aspect, help me with the numbers. So sports would always be behind the numbers. And then the second one I would give his credit to my dad, who I love very much. And he recently retired. He was an accountant for his lifetime. And so, his life was spent with tax returns and profit and loss statements. And, he taught me and said, no matter what you want to do in life, I insist that if I'm going to pay for your college education, that you do some classes in either economics or accounting. And so I did that at his insistence. And at that time, I may have, said some not so nice words and insisted he help me through the class, given it wasn't my choice to be doing intro to accounting or other accounting classes. But to the extent I got a class or two under my belt, he was right in the long run. I will admit he was right in the long run. And I love numbers and crunching numbers in part because of being around someone who always made his life crunching numbers and insisting that at the very least I had a very basic education on dollars and cents and accounting as part of my education in college.
Well, it definitely shows every time that you publish that information, and you can tell when you publish the information, the analytics that you put into it, you put a story behind it as well. So it's just not, there's meaning to it besides, hey, this is up or this is down by X percent. So yeah, it's fantastic information that you put out there.
I think that goes back to something we said earlier, the hats that I wear. And so there are others, I want to be careful how I say this, there are other news outlets out there that love data, put data out there. And I've always believed data is important to a story, but data cannot be the story in and of itself. Data is not the complete story. Data is the supplement to the story, the color to the story, but it is not the entire, if we think of it from an artistic point of view, the entire portrait can't be the data. The data provides color and background, and it's necessary to have color and background to have a beautiful painting. But the foreground and the important part is a fundamental part of journalism, which will never go away, which is talking to people. That's why my schedule every day is filled with conversations with shippers and IMCs and NVOs and carriers and intermodal providers, because the numbers tell a story, but at the end of the day, people want to know the story behind the numbers and the why. And so my goal, and I appreciate the kind words that you have given me on this, is to tell stories that have a mixture of commentary, context, and then data as the background to it. And anyone who tries to report the news without all of those components together is missing a fundamental part of covering stories.
And that is the reason why the Journal of Commerce, for me, is the number one publication that I go to for what's going on in the supply chain industry here in the United States and around the world. For that exact reason.
And I appreciate that very much. We've always been that way. And all I'm doing is I'm hopefully adding intermodal data that didn't exist before. The JOC, which has always been great, has the history with peers to do this on the international side. So now we bring that more in the domestic world. I think it's a rare thing in journalism to have that, because there's so much news out there that's just garbage, just mud throwing in both directions, or, who's the bad guy? Look at what's going on and look at who's to blame about it. And, it doesn't really go into the nuance or the depth of an issue. And life is more complicated than a lot of mainstream journalism gives credit for, because they don't have the time or attention, or they don't feel like their readers have the time or attention, or their listeners have the time and the attention to go beyond the Twitter universe of X number of characters, but they do. And so I've always appreciated that we as a news organization go to a different place where we go into the nuance and we paint that full picture of why is something happening and explaining the complexities behind it. And very, very quickly, I would give you a perfect example of that being a recent story that I did on international chassis. And so the thing I wrote about here was that there are a number of cities. Cincinnati is one in your neck of the woods, guys, that you would know of, where rail ramps are open on the weekend. So NS, the Norfolk Southern, is open Saturday and Sunday in Cincinnati. CSX is open on Saturday in Cincinnati. And in the international world, the chassis depots are not open on the weekend. And so we have this situation where there are containers that are made available at grounded facilities and chassis depots that are not open. So on the surface, mainstream media would write the story of, look at how unfair that is. Look at how the big bad railroads and the big bad chassis providers and the big bad ocean carriers are out to screw the shipper. And more I go into that story, it's not meant to be as an apologist, because my duty is to present all sides of the story and present why there are legitimate questions in that realm of fairness and reasonableness of charging penalties for boxes sitting over the weekend on excess days in a terminal, but to go deeper into that and really explore the complexities of the business and economics on why some chassis depots are closed on the weekends and why they don't run extra hours on the weekends. That's the type of journalism you don't see anywhere else, because everyone else is either into who's to blame for it, who's the bad guy, or let's drown you in so much data and not give you any larger context of the who, what, where, when, and why, and just pure numbers, that they miss the larger story. Hopefully, I've not offended too many people in journalism with that.
All right. So before we leave the background completely, you mentioned WFAN. I actually happen to be a Mets fan too. And so I've had experience with listening to it from time to time over the years. And when you say an overnight call screener, when you're an intern there, I just think of a lot of the characters that are regular callers with their takes on sports and whatever else. So do you have any particular story that sticks out in your mind from that period of time?
The hardest part of the call screener part of the job. So an intern there, at least when I was there, was sort of two parts. You'd have your day side interns who would, for the most part, they were ingesting sound, cutting sound, putting the sound in the system, making sure that audio was ready to go for the producers and the update people to be able to do and hit and play on air without them having to do that legwork. The overnight person was mainly a call screener and then also helped out with the audio. The hardest part of that call screener part was to parse out who is a legitimate caller and who maybe shouldn't go on air. Because the last thing that you want in any live radio or TV situation, and as I think about this, I think of how C-SPAN totally gets caught in this all the time.
Yeah.
Is the last thing you want is to have your hosts dump sound, dump the caller, dump the sound, whether it's a curse word or you're just, doing some sort of thing that obviously can't get on the air. It's not, you're not going to get fired because of it, because, the radio hosts are all trained in dumping sound and eating into that 7-second delay that most stations have built in for that. But you don't want that to happen. And so you sit there as an intern, as someone who's trying to please the people that you work for, maybe even have it turn into a job later on. And so you really have to do a good job in the overnight when, hate to say it, a lot of the crazies do come out in the overnight, and really parse who is a caller who's going to sound good on the air versus someone who's either going to be rambling or is going to drop a curse word or do something that's going to require to be dumped. And so you had to be on your toes with that. And it was interesting. Let me put it that way.
Did you have any that got through that stick out in your mind?
I don't recall ever anyone getting through that had to be dumped. There were a couple of occasions I remember where callers would get through that just kept going on and on and on and on and on and on. You do your best as you can as a screener. And this actually was a job I had to do for a while, WTOP as well, with our live guests who would come on and talk about news of the day. Do your best to try and vet who is the type of person who can give you a 60-second answer, 30, 60, maybe at most 90-second answer versus the one who's going to go on for 4 or 5 minutes nonstop. And so there were a couple times where, I didn't accurately capture it, and the guy would just keep talking and talking and talking, and you could tell the host was uncomfortable and trying to find a way to jump in edgewise to stop the person from going on and regain control of that conversation. They never held it against me. I think out of the two, the person who curses or says something that has to be dumped is far more troublesome than the someone who rambles on and on and on, but it was a challenge.
Yeah, well, you had the regulars there who would actually be calling just to have somebody to chat with, I think, some some of the time too.
That did help. We did have regulars when I was there. The overnight host was Joe Beningo, who still does stuff on Saturday mornings at WFAN, and he actually had a book of regular callers who would often come in. So to the extent I had names I recognized, that made it easier. And Joe was always good about cutting off people who tended to ramble. So I had good people that I worked with that made it a lot easier.
Okay, Rick, thanks for the indulgence there on WFAN. We'll move back into the freight side. So one of the things you've said in getting into journalism is having that interest in informing and educating people about what's going on in the world and how it affects their lives. How does freight do that to you?
What I love about this job is it's as much about business and economics as it is about freight. And so while I don't have the time and bandwidth to be in touch with the inner workings of the economic conditions and all of these various sectors that freight touches, you need to have a healthy appreciation of where the US economy is, where various key parts of the US economy are. You need to have a sense of where is industrial production. You have to have a sense of where the retail industry is. You have to have a sense of the types of industries that are doing well in any economic environment and the types of industries that are suffering in an environment. But also, this sort of training from the very beginning, which I credit to my mentors at WTOP, a guy named Jim Farley, who was my first ever program director, actually is probably also single-handedly responsible for the fact that I'm on Sirius XM radio quite regularly, because their afternoon drive program also was a disciple of Jim Farley. And Jim would teach me at the end of the day, your job as a reporter is to connect the dots and to take issues that on the surface you may not understand why it matters to the average reader. And your duty as a journalist is to connect the dots for them and explain to them, why does this issue matter to them? And so I always approach these stories in the freight world by thinking of, how do I make this story matter to, if possible, the average Joe? In certain cases, that may not be possible. So at the very least, how do I make this story a story that explains why does it matter not just to the freight industry, but to the Fortune 100 or Fortune 500 or Fortune 1000 companies who are selling products to the average Jane and Doe every day? And how can I distill that into a message that at least gets as close to the average human being who is a mother or father or son or daughter or just a person going about their lives? How can I get it as close as I can to them, explain to them why it matters? And so I try my best to explain as I can in the numbers data and the rate data that I provide that transportation costs are part of the cost of goods that people buy in stores. So the relevancy of my stories on freight are, to the extent people can make educated decisions on making transportation costs as manageable as possible, at the end of the day, the winner is also the American consumer, because the cost of what you buy in a store is at least in part related to the transportation landed costs that take place in order to get that product to the store shelf.
Agreed. So the one thing so speaking of connecting the dots and the economy, one of the things that's been passed around quite a bit lately is the term freight recession. So from your perspective, your 30,000-foot view of the world, how do you see the freight market at this moment, and really, where do you think it's going?
I would have said 3 months ago that and probably did say 3 months ago that we were in a freight recession. And, I know there are others out there that said last year that we were in a freight recession. I would only say to that eventually, if you say it enough, it'll eventually be true.
Right.
And so the question is timing more than anything else. But I would also add at this point, the fact that JB Hunt said on their earnings call, we are in a freight recession, I think gives no doubt to what was fairly obvious in the volume and rate data that comes from IANA, the Intermodal Association of North America, and the American Association of Railroads, your data, Rick. Whether we're talking volume or we're talking rates, I think we've known for several months now, and JB Hunt was just sort of the icing on the cake that was already built, that we are in a freight recession. And how deep is that recession? I don't know. How far along do we go before we hit bottom? I also don't know, because And it's a good question that you asked, because I was just recently talking to a truckload broker, I haven't looked at the trend, my former employer transport topics list, but I would guess this broker is probably one of the top 25 freight brokers in the United States, but a private company. And so we were talking about, when does this freight recession end, is part of your question lended to. And his commentary was the supply side, the driver's side. And he was saying, I haven't seen enough on the driver's side to see the small carrier fold. I will give our competitor credit for this term, the bloodbath. I hate that term, but it's okay. I will apply it here. They have not seen the bloodbath yet in terms of small carrier capacity in the truckload market to be able to correct the supply side that would cause rates to come back up in the truckload spot market. And then I kind of came back and said, as we've talked about here, you're right on the supply side. I totally agree with this person. If we look at it from a demand perspective and not a supply perspective, as I said to him, even if we had an agreement covering the West Coast ports where, there's a lot of uneasiness that a strike may happen, even if we signed a deal tomorrow and that news story went away, we still have the economic aspect of it. Still back to my last answer of connecting this back to the common person going to the store, whether the cause is inflation, which is certainly part of this, or robust economic activity slowing down, whatever it may be, the average American has not bought the way that they did in late 20 and 21 and part of 22. And so the fact that, we're not buying stuff means that companies are not moving stuff because they're not bringing it in from overseas. And to the extent they're not bringing it in from overseas, that means there's not much freight moving out of Southern California, which, sorry to say, is going to drive most freight markets pretty much 99.9% of the time. And so even a company like JB Hunt, who may not be in the international world, made very clear in their earnings report and their earnings call that part of the freight recession is clearly tied to port volumes out of LA and Long Beach. And suffice it to say, port volumes in LA and Long Beach are a significant feeder into the domestic transportation market, domestic intermodal, domestic truckload, LTL, across the board. So how long does a freight recession last is not just a bloodbath question, and when do we see that bloodbath actually happen, but is also an economic question on when do we get to a place where the American consumer feels comfortable spending their dollars again in a way that they did in late 20 and 21 and 22. The answer is I don't know.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of California, we have seen some movement on the labor situation there as of late. How close do you think we are to potentially seeing some sort of signed contract there?
It's all about the union in my mind on this one. There has been movement from the shipper community to try and pressure the Biden administration to get involved. I don't see that happening like the Biden administration and then Congress got involved in the rail strike situation. And that gets back to the economics behind it and why I don't like politics. Politics is, I've said to, and I actually don't think this is all that controversial because I've said this on Sirius XM with some of my friends at Politico and Axios and Reuters and other publications and transportation folks at those publications that cover politics all the time. Politics these days seem to be, to me, it seems to be lurching from crisis to crisis to crisis, and that they don't get involved in something until it reaches a crisis level. And so the only reason they got involved in the rail strike situation last year was because it reached a crisis situation and we had enough demand at that point in September and even, just the holiday aspect of Christmas, enough of a motivation and crisis aspect that Washington, D.C. paid attention because neither one of them wanted to be tagged, particularly in September, so close to a midterm election, as the reason why a supply chain crisis reemerged. So there was motivation for Washington to pressure the unions and the railroads to come to a deal. And that deal happened at the end of the day because Washington, D.C. politicians said, as much as we respect the unions, we are not going to let the union strike and create a supply chain crisis, and we will fight for them as soon as we make this deal happen. All the things they asked about, but we cannot allow them to strike over it we will work with them to get those concessions afterwards. And a lot of them did. You guys know this. The railroads have made significant concessions, not to everyone yet, but to a number of unions on a lot of the sick pay and workday provisions that were threatening a strike last year. Back around to your original question is, I don't see that happening on the port side. So there's no crisis. If we had, because of the economy, if we had the port shut down for 5 or 10 days, yes, there would be, even 15 days, there would be certain types of commodities like fashion that have a very short shelf life that may be in perilous situation. But the average type of shipper has enough of an inventory position right now that would not create a catastrophic situation for them. So there isn't this motivation for Washington, D.C. to step in and say, guys, you need to make a deal. We're not going to allow a strike to happen, because there isn't this threat of a supply chain crisis happening from a 5 to 10 or 15 day strike. And therefore, the union sits there and says, I don't have to make a deal. I don't have to make a deal now. I could strike. I don't have to strike. Nobody's pushing us to do anything. And so I don't know when a deal is struck, but the idea is that unless someone pushes the union to make a deal, the union has absolutely no motivation right now to do anything other than the status quo and just sit on their hands and knees and wait until they get a deal that they really like. And if they don't, then they're just going to sit and wait.
All right. So we don't want to keep you much longer. So Ari, tell us where people can find some of your work.
You can find my articles on the Journal of Commerce website, which is joc.com for the JOC. You can find me on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on Twitter. You just put in my name, first name spelled Ari. My last name is spelled Ashe. I'm one of the first search results that almost always comes up. If you guys don't mind, if I can make a quick plug for some of the indices that I do on Intermodal, just to kind of let the audience know a little bit about that.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to let them know that the one that, you guys work with me on, the Intermodal Savings Index, which we put out numbers every month and then a quarterly report, is the measurement of how much an average shipper should save by picking 53-foot intermodal, working with companies such as InTek, and saving money with that intermodal option versus using the truckload option. And so we know that in an average market, a shipper should save 26-27% in transportation costs by using a company such as InTek and 53-foot intermodal compared to the truckload industry. And then the second data set that I want people to know about, it's a new data set we're working on, is this intermodal service scorecard. We want the IMCs such as InTek and shippers out there that use companies such as InTek to let us know who is executing the best. And so, companies like InTek, we want to know what railroad's doing the best job helping InTek serve its customers. And then for InTek's customers and shippers with other companies, we want to know which companies out there are doing the best job servicing your accounts. And that all feeds into a narrative that we can tell through companies such as InTek, and feeds into that conference we'll be doing September 25th to 27th in Chicago that you can reach out to me for if you want to participate or attend, where we go in depth really into all of these issues on who's executing well, who's not executing well, and what can be done to enhance the shipper experience on all forms of transportation, from trucking to intermodal to LTL to parcel.
Great. Thank you very much, Ari. And we'll hope to have you back on down the road too.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ari.
Anytime you want, happy to help.
Let's jump into headlines as we take a closer look at some top logistics and supply chain news. And this headline segment is kind of a catch-all for a few different topics related to California. So we've done a blog post on this earlier this month on the InTek Freight and Logistics blog, so you can read along there to get a little bit more detail. But that title is California Truck Regulations and Port Labor Update. So we talked with Ari a little bit about the labor situation at the West Coast ports and how there continues not to be a deal. There was a little bit of movement over the last few weeks or so, partially because depending on who you talk to, whatever reason it occurred, there was a closure of the ports for a couple of days early in April. And the Longshore Workers Union, the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, actually put out a statement just last week saying that they'd agreed on some additional key points with the Pacific Maritime Association, who runs the ports. So I guess the bottom line for this is there still currently is not an agreement, and that's one contributing factor to a little bit of a shift that's occurred. for the volume that had been going to California, going to other places.
Yeah, and as Ari was speaking earlier, he was mentioning that there's a lot of things that we work on tends to be based off of a crisis, and at this point in time, there really isn't a crisis out anywhere in terms of freight volumes running through the ports. Volumes are definitely down across all ports, so the leverage on that side isn't where it would have been if this was conversation still happening in 2020, 21, and
yeah, and imagine if this was happening when there were 100 ships off the coast. I think maybe that crisis idea would have played into it a little bit more.
That's right. But one of the things that has come out as a byproduct of this, the negotiations on the West Coast and the ports, is we've seen shippers. There has been a switch in their mentality where a number of shippers were really pushing the majority, if not all, their volumes through Southern California. And this has actually moved a lot of thinking that said, hey, we need to distribute our inbound through the East Coast and through even the Southeast Coast so that they can go ahead and spread their supply chain risk across the board. And what this has taught shippers over this time period is that, the East Coast ports can do a great job, and they have, and they've really sucked up a lot of the volumes. They did it when volumes were extremely heavy during the pandemic times, and a lot of the shippers have not gone back on that, and some have actually increased the amount of freight that they've moved through on the East Coast.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is it did actually start because of the port backup to some degree. They were doing it while it was in the craziness period still, and now there are other reasons why they've not been moving back, and, part of these other reasons are some labor uncertainty there. We also get into a couple of other pieces, the AB5 law, which has still thrown especially drayage operators into a little bit of uncertainty with the owner-operator versus independent contractor versus having to become an employee of a larger organization and provide certain benefits and things like that. This law has been... The original version of this law was signed back in 2020. There's been litigation surrounding it pretty much as soon as it passed the legislature in California. The litigation looked like it was sort of dying down when the Supreme Court declined to continue to enforce an injunction, and that was last summer. And so we're 8 months past that particular Supreme Court decision or lack of decision. And we still don't really have a lot of clarity on this particular issue.
No, we don't have a lot of clarity. And the issue, while it's not called the AB5 rule or AB5 law, that's really associated with California, that wording. The thought of taking that same type of law and carrying it across all states of the U.S. Is becoming an issue and something that's being discussed. And without having, clarity on what's happened in California and the ruling on California, it's spreading a lot more uncertainty across all drayage community in the various states outside of just California.
Yeah, California can tend to be a little bit of a leader on some issues. If something passes there and gets enforced, then other places may follow, and others have followed with similar thoughts. And as you said, even the potential for it to be nationalized to some degree. The current state is these legal challenges are still underway, maybe even another injunction. And California still hasn't really jumped into hardcore enforcement of whatever rules have come from this.
Not at this point in time.
So at this point, we're still kind of watching that too, and the market is watching that too, and it's added another, piece to that puzzle of maybe why people are staying a little bit away from the California ports. And then there's even another piece that has come up from California relating to, again, the most immediate impact on this, I think, is drayage. Again, with the ruling that the EPA is allowing California to move forward with its latest round of regulations relating to trucks, that they're trying to basically move from a diesel heavy operation to eventually getting to an mostly electric operation. The implementation of that is sort of phased over the next 10 plus years to 2035, but one of the immediate implications, or almost immediate implications of it, is no new trucks can be added to the dray registry to be allowed to do that kind of job at the ports in the state if they're not electric starting January 1.
Right.
And so when you're talking about that, that's typically 1,500 to 2,000 trucks each year are retired and cycled out, and 1,500 to 2,000 replace those. So that means either people will be less likely to retire some trucks that maybe should be retired next year, or they have to come up with 1,500 to 2,000 electric trucks next year. So that'll be interesting to see, because the supply is still a little iffy on that regard. And then there's also the supply of power, electricity to charge those.
Yes, I was going to cover both of those pieces as well, because, the supply is a little bit tight on where those electric trucks will be coming from. So my general opinion at this point in time are people are going to run their trucks a little bit longer until the electric truck is proven out a little bit more, and until they know that there's going to be a charging station and they're not waiting in long lines to get themselves charged up to go ahead and continue to run that day, or however they're going to run in the evening as well.
And as you mentioned with AB5, and again, AB5 is just shorthand for that one, but as you mentioned with that, there are 8 states that have basically said that they're going to adopt a similar version of these regulations. So, and those do include some port states too on the East Coast. New York, New Jersey, I believe, are both in there. So this is something that's coming up pretty soon, will need to be addressed. There are companies that have sort of jumped into the fray regarding potentially adding these charging stations. But a lot of it, I think it's hard to say which one's which. Is it the inventory? I don't think there are a lot of options out there yet for this kind of truck that's just easy to go out and get right now. And then the charging stations. So both of those are pretty interesting questions to get to that point where it's practical. But at least with drayage trucks, the battery situation and all of that it's reasonable to assume that can be accomplished fairly quickly.
I would actually say that the drayage community, or the drayage, the operations of drayage on a daily basis actually plays much better to go electric now than the long haul. And that's because of the density and the short haul that those dray drivers are moving every day. There's a natural fit somewhere in that operation, with it being so close and tight within, the daily drives that they have, or the daily runs, that there's a way to be able to figure out and have the density and volume to make those charging stations work and be able to make that economically feasible to continue on and move forward.
Yeah, it does seem like if they get to that point where they find the right solution for charging, they don't need to be, they don't need to stop in the middle of a 2-day trip. They just need to park somewhere for a while when they're not being used. And it can be like an overnight charge, like, a person would have with a car in their garage or something like that. So it does seem like there's a solution there. It'll be interesting to see how quickly the technology moves for the long haul side, though, because that's a whole different kind of challenge. And there's still some talk related to whether we're going to end up with the pure electric or the hydrogen fuel cell, because those can go longer. But now there's a ticking clock on them.
Yes, absolutely.
On our Mercury Gate Minute, one of our experts on Mercury Gate Transportation Management Systems software, TMS for short, answers a question, outlines a feature, or offers up a quick tip on using the platform. Here's Tracy with the latest.
Today we're going to talk about documents using Docmosis in the Mercury Gate system. Mercury Gate provides a large list of base documents such as BOLs, tenders, customer invoices, delivery notices, and commercial invoices, just to name a few. They can be generated automatically or manually and then attached to a load for future reference. These documents are created using a Docmosis template. Docmosis allows us to make changes to the base documents and tailor them according to your business needs. We can make small changes, such as adding a reference to a customer invoice, or much larger changes, such as reformatting the design. We can also add your company logo for a more professional look.
For more information on InTek's Mercury Gate partnership, visit www.intechfreight-logistics.com/TMS. Thanks for joining us for InTek Freight and Logistics, the podcast. And thanks very much to Ari Ashe for taking the time to speak with us. Check out the links in the description to learn more about everything we discussed. Subscribe or follow now to ensure you get our latest episodes as soon as they're available. And you can help us out by rating and reviewing us wherever you listen. If you have questions, email us at podcast@intechlogistics.com and visit intechfreight-logistics.com for more about what we do. For Rick Lagore, I'm Kevin Baxter. We'll talk to you next time.